So once you've completed your data due diligence process and you've gone out to market and selected an exceptional SaaS product and also an implementation partner who will help you with the migration, then it's about considering what detail goes into the contracts with those suppliers. We're going to start by looking at the agreement between the customer and the implementation partner, and then we'll move on to the contract with the vendor. The first thing we want to talk about is use restrictions. And so from a customer's perspective, your data is obviously hugely important to you, and in addition, you might have privacy or indeed other legal obligations in respect of that data. And so you might want to ensure, you probably do want to ensure, that the implementation partner will use your data solely for the purposes of providing you with implementation services and not for any other purpose.
So I think from an implementation partner's perspective, I would be looking for an assurance from the customer in relation to the customer data that it provides to me, or that I will have access to in order to provide the services. And that assurance will be along the lines that the customer has the rights and the consents that it requires in order to allow me to be able to access and use that data to perform my obligations. I'm also likely to look for an indemnity from the customer in relation to customer data that it provides to me. And that indemnity will be in order to protect me in the event that a third party makes a claim against me as a result of data that the customer has provided to me and which I have used in accordance with the agreement.
And so the next thing we want to touch on is security. As a customer, you will want to ensure that your data is secure, A, because it is confidential information and you won't want it to be compromised, and B, where personal information is involved, then you will have an obligation to ensure that it is protected from unauthorized use and disclosure. And in the case where you are giving your data to a third party, in this case the implementation partner, you also have an obligation to ensure that everything within your power is done to prevent it against unauthorized use and unauthorized disclosure. And so as a customer, you would be looking to impose obligations on the implementation partner to maintain security measures at least as protective of your data as your own security policies. Now, from supplier form contracts are likely to promise only reasonable security measures or perhaps adherence to industry standard security measures. And while these promises sound good in the abstract, they are still open to interpretation. And so from a customer's perspective, if you can't get your own security measures in place, then it's preferable to specify an actual independent security standard, such as an ISO standard, for example, for the implementation partner to follow and perhaps even be audited against, or at least keep it updated regularly.
So from an implementation partner's perspective, the extent to which I am going to be willing to take on a responsibility for security of data will really depend on the demarcation of responsibility between the customer, myself, and the vendor of the solution. And to understand that demarcation, I'll really want to understand the nature of the services that I provide and the environment within which I'm going to provide those services. So for example, if I am asked to be involved in data migration, I will want to understand the extent to which that migration takes or happens within the customer's environment. Does it happen within the vendor's environment? And if either of those things are correct, then I would want to ensure that my responsibility for data security is limited to the extent that I do something within those environments that creates the data loss or the security incident. And the reason why I want to be clear on demarcation is because as an implementation partner, I have very limited control or no control over the environment of a customer or a vendor. And so I would certainly want to understand my responsibility and the demarcation and where that sits.
And so in terms of liability, this is all about allocation of risk. From the customer's perspective, you would probably be looking for broad indemnification from the implementation partner for damages arising out of their failure to comply with the confidentiality obligations and security obligations. The customer would also want to carefully review any provisions that might limit the implementation partner's liability, including exclusions of consequential damages or caps on overall monetary liability. This is really important because the damages that can arise from data breaches may include a variety of losses, such as notification-related costs, which is particularly important under the new Privacy Act, legal and IT-related fees, and also reputational harm. These types of damages are typically difficult to quantify and could very well exceed the general cap on liability and fall within the usual exclusions of indirect loss. And so as a customer, ideally you'd be looking to have no exclusions or limits of the implementation partner's liability in relation to breaches of confidentiality or failure to comply with their security obligations.
But as we all know, we do not live in an ideal world. So as an implementation partner, what I would be willing to accept in terms of liability will again really depend on that demarcation of responsibility in terms of data security and protection. I am likely to push back on having an uncapped liability for a data security incident or data loss, but I may be willing to look at a different cap and what we refer to as a super cap in respect of data loss and data security incidents. Now, in terms of what that super cap looks like, generally speaking, it's a multiple of the general liability cap that sits in the agreement, or it could be a number that that the customer and I, as the implementation partner, are comfortable with in terms of a higher cap for data loss.
Yeah, so then it really becomes a question as to what is the value of that super cap. And so from a customer's perspective, we'd obviously want it to be as high as possible. But in terms of calculating what that might be, it could be helpful to consider whether as a customer you would want your implementation partner to maintain insurance, and then the value of that insurance coverage could inform the calculation of the super cap.